Welcome to my YouTube channel. My guest on Facing the Canon is Dr. Sharon Dirckx, an apologist. Dr. Sharon Dirckx, welcome to Facing the Canon.
Thank you.
Lovely to have you, Sharon. You went to university, I think it was Bristol University.
That's right.
You were not a Christian. What would you have called yourself at the time?
Yeah, I think I would have probably described myself as an agnostic. I remember, knowing from an early age that I loved the sciences and remember my A-level biology teacher handing me this book by someone called Richard Dawkins, and this was back in the early 80s, and he'd just written this book called The Selfish Gene, and so I was kind of reading things like that and had just absorbed the view that, that pretty much God didn't exist, but I didn't sort of believe that in a very antagonistic way, and that, you couldn't really marry any sort of belief with being a credible thinking person and certainly not a scientist. But I think I had just absorbed my view and wasn't holding it really strongly, but arrived at Bristol an agnostic, I'd pretty much say.
And what were you studying?
I'd arrived to study biochemistry.
Right, and then you got invited to go and hear some Christians who were being grilled for their faith and being asked all sorts of questions.
Yeah.
And something shifted.
That's right, yeah. In the very first week I was invited to what's known as Guerrilla Christian, and that was intriguing to me. And so I went along to this event where there were 4 Christians in a row. The room was full. It was during Freshers Week, and I asked, about halfway through the evening, having listened to their answers to lots of different questions, I put my hand up and asked my question, which was, surely you can't believe in God and be a scientist at the same time? And I was actually given the answer that yes, you can. And this, even a simple answer that they gave was actually, it was a game changer for me. It actually set me on a track of thinking, okay, well, I need to really, I clearly haven't thought about this as much as I should have done, and it set me on a trajectory of grilling more Christians over the next 18 months and asking a lot more questions. And
reassessing your own position.
Reassessing, very much.
And then
so.
realising that actually what you were standing on was quite flawed.
It just wasn't thought through. I just had kind of decided. I mean, nobody wakes up one day with and deciding, okay, I'm going to be an atheist or an agnostic. I think we just absorb it from media, from books, magazines, TV, and I think that is what I had done. And at the same time, I don't think there was a Christian witness in my school environment. If there was, I was completely unaware of it. And so it wasn't really until being at university that I began to, in this hall of residence, see these notices asking these provocative questions like, is this life all that there is? And what are we as human beings? And these really caught my attention on the way up the stairs to the canteen. And so, it was a real time of journeying and really reassessing my beliefs.
You then graduated, you went and did further studies at Cambridge. What did you study?
Yes, so I did a year in industry first, and there discovered MRI and loved the idea that you can look inside the human body without cutting into it, and actually grew to become very interested in brain imaging, and so began to look for PhDs in that area, which took me to Cambridge, which is also where I met my husband. We met in a brain imaging lab. How romantic is that? I know, is that?
Yes. Go on, what is brain imaging?
Yes, well, there are lots of different kinds, but I was looking at MRI, which stands for magnetic resonance imaging, and it's a way of using the water molecules that are naturally in your body to generate a picture of your body, a 3D image of it. And that's a structural MRI. But I was also looking at functional MRI, which is looking at the activity in your brain when you do something. So you put someone in a scanner and you give them a very well-designed activity to do, like it might be something like tap their fingers, which activates their motor areas in their brain, or remember some stuff, which uses their working memory. And you can generate maps of brain activity based on the blood flow in your brain. And so you're not giving anyone any artificial drugs or anything that's bad for them. You're using the natural properties of your body to generate images. And so I spent 3.5 years doing a PhD in this area.
Well, tell us, Sharon, tell us some facts about the brain.
Oh, gosh. At any one moment, your brain is generating enough electricity to power an LED light.
Yes.
So if you're having a light bulb moment at this precise moment, it's for good reason. I also had the very kind of sobering opportunity to dissect a human brain when I was doing postdoctoral research in the States. It looks a little bit like mushroom, but thankfully a lot more going on than simply what's going on in a mushroom.
How big is the brain?
The human brain weighs about 1.5 kilos, a couple of pounds. It uses 20% of your body's energy, despite only taking up 2% of its weight, which is why when you're working really hard and you're eating a lot, you're actually not gaining any weight because you're burning energy. It uses a lot of energy from just burns a lot of energy.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
It's a fascinating organ. And,
yes. And you went on to do more further research.
I did. So after my PhD, which was looking more at the methodology involved, at a time when functional MRI was actually really just getting going, I then went on to do a postdoc which looked at what was happening in the brain in cocaine addiction. So I was working with cocaine addicts at the Medical College of Wisconsin in the USA, and spent 3 years working with them and looking at cocaine in the brain in an ethically approved study, by the way, by the US government.
Wow.
And also comparing it with a drug called methylphenidate, which is also what we know as Ritalin, given in ADHD, and looking at the impact of these two things on the brain and comparing them.
You're a scientist, you've spent many, many years in research. You're currently an apologist. What is an apologist?
Well, I guess you can have apologists for all kinds of things, but an apologist in a Christian sense is someone who gives reasons as to why we believe what we do, and those reasons can help us to kind of ground, not just knowing that we believe, but knowing why we believe it. And so I guess the word itself we get from the New Testament when the Apostle Peter says, always be ready to give a reason to anyone who asks you, always be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you for the reason, for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect. The Greek word for answer is apologia. I don't need to say that to you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it means kind of a reasoned defense, like you would give in a court of law. And so apologetics can be involving giving reasons why you can believe in God and be a scientist, why the Bible can be trusted, why you can actually still believe in a God who is loving and powerful, even in the face of suffering. And we use it to talk about why Christianity is saying something a bit different from other belief systems, and all kinds of areas that are still really relevant. And it's particularly important in the age that we find ourselves in, where we're seeing people who have not actually grown up in the Christian faith, who have not necessarily picked up a Bible in their lifetime. And so we can't simply start with the words of Jesus as a starting point. We have to say why we can even trust those words in the first place, and unpack a bit of the context. And so, yeah.
So I'm just intrigued, Sharon. What motivated you to move from being a scientist to being an apologist?
Yes, you could argue I'm still a scientist, just my data is different.
That's very good.
Yes. but there were some, so it was when we moved to the States and I was doing this postdoc in cocaine addiction, I found a couple of things happened. First of all, I started having all of these opportunities to have conversations with my colleagues in the lab that I was in, and all kinds of people were coming out of the woodwork with questions. I ended up doing seeker Bible studies in coffee shops with 2 or 3 of my work colleagues, and just meeting others for coffee and taking their questions. And there was a hunger to know about spiritual things that was happening in parallel with the research that I was doing. At the same time, we got ourselves involved in a really fantastic church, and I met this wonderful evangelist, a lady called Debbie, who I'm still in touch with now, and she was clearly very, very gifted at spotting people that didn't know the Lord and meeting with them and leading them to Christ. And I hadn't met anyone like that before. And now, up until by this point, I had been a Christian for 6 or 7 years. Now, maybe I just hadn't noticed. Maybe it was that actually the Lord had other things to do in my life to get me to that point. But I suddenly found myself thinking, okay, I know I'm supposed to want to be like Jesus, but I also want to be like Debbie. I see something in her that actually inspires me, and I want that. And I think that's biblical, actually.
Absolutely.
And so, I started meeting with Debbie, and Debbie gave me this way to do a 6-week one-to-one investigator Bible study. And so I was able to meet with colleagues and do that. And so I realized during this postdoc that I was an evangelist.
Yes.
I had the gift of an evangelist. And then I was thinking, well, what do I do with that? Is that something that just happens alongside my research, or does God want me to do more? And then in parallel with that, we felt called back to the UK and to kind of reach people here, because there are many here, and the proportion of those that don't know Christ is very high. And these same friends, Debbie and her husband, had attended a conference and had heard about a centre that was being set up in the UK that was going to train people to give reasons and venture into this area of apologetics. And so I applied to study at what is now known as OCCA. And that was partly at Wycliffe Hall at the time. And so that was the beginning of the transition. I studied for a year. I then returned to science for a few more years but then joining the team at OCCA as a team member.
So OCCA now, which is based in Oxford, what does OCCA stand for?
Yeah, OCCA stands for the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics.
And what do you offer? What does OCCA offer?
So OCCA offers training for people who are interested in being skilled up in responding to questions. And we do our training in a very interactive way. We want to have a close interaction with those that come to study. We're in the process of building online courses, so people can join us from wherever they are in the world. It's accessible. You can study alongside holding down a job. And we also go out and speak, and we offer bespoke training to churches and conferences and organizations. And we also go and speak on different topics. If people want to hold an event and have an apologist evangelist come and speak on, so tomorrow evening I'm speaking on, is there anything special about being human? People are going to invite their friends in their 20s and 30s and hear a response to that. So we do things like that as well.
Wonderful. And here I've got just two of your books. Am I just my brain? So obviously, having studied the brain and spent years in research with regard to the brain, that was an obvious title for one of your books. But tell us, what is this about?
Yes, well, in short, the answer is no, just in case, spoiler alert for those of you that weren't sure. But so there are all kinds of questions being asked about what people are. What is a human being? What are we? Are we just advanced apes that have managed to climb to the top of, the food chain and the evolutionary tree? Or are we machines? Or are we souls trapped in a body longing to escape one day to float off to heaven? What are we? And there's a narrative out there from some, not all, but some scientists and philosophers that says, look, you are your brain. Your brain drives who you are. Everything that you think, say, and do is explainable by the activity in your head, by these non-conscious processes in your synapses. And so I wanted to respond to that. We find this narrative a lot. Even if you just walk into a bookshop, you see a lot of popular level books that assume this fact. And so I wanted to write something that was accessible to anyone, whatever you believe, whether you believe in God or not, but that actually addresses the questions in a rigorous way. And the heart of it is that, you don't just have a brain, you have a mind as well. You have a brain with all of its kind of neurons and chemicals and transmitters and synapses, but you also have a mind with all of its thoughts and feelings and emotions and memories. And there's something that it is like to be you, that just capturing data from your brain isn't gonna capture in quite the same way. If we were to try and do a study, J.John, of what it's like for you to write your next book, and we thought, okay, you are your brain, we're gonna put an EEG cap on you, you're gonna wear that pretty much the whole time, even when you're asleep, because you're writing when you're asleep as well, right? And we'll pop you in an MRI scanner, we'll take some MRI scans, functional and structural, and we'll collect some really interesting data from your brain. Will that tell us what it is like for you to write your next book?
No.
No.
No, of course not.
Of course not. I mean, it will tell us something, but it won't tell us everything. And if we want to know what it's like for you to write your next book, we have to ask you. And so, there is so much more to a human being than just their brain activity. And that's not to say that neuroscience isn't telling us wonderful and extraordinary things about the human brain. And clearly, it is correlated with the mind. When you use your mind, your brain is activated. And clearly, these two things are connected and integrated. But to simply chalk a person down to the cell voltages and neurotransmitters in their brain is to offer a diminished view of a human being. And so my intention with this book was to open up that conversation and show that this is not enough to describe human beings. We also, you actually don't even need to leave neuroscience to see that humans are complex. All kinds of fascinating observations made in the clinic about patients with large chunks of their brain missing but still very intact minds, and people who have had to have their two hemispheres separated because of epilepsy, and essentially their brain is cut in two, but they're still one person, an integrated person. Of course, some interesting changes happen, but they're still just one being. And of course, there's the very fascinating topic of near-death experiences, where people who are in a state of reversible clinical death that report being conscious.
Now, you write about that, and you've looked into that. What did you discover as you researched that area?
I discovered that it is a lot more rigorous than people think. It's not just anecdotal evidence. What happened, it's a data set that's only arisen since we've been able to kind of have people in that state of clinical death, since we've had cardiac surgery and neurological surgery, where people have to be cooled to a very low temperature. Their brain EEG signal is, there isn't any detectable signal, and their heart is stopped, and they're in a state in order for this surgery to be performed. And what surgeons used to hear was that some of their patients were reporting upon resuscitation that they had been conscious. And so that caused some surgeons to collect some systematic data across all of their patient groups, and there are studies from different countries capturing this. There's a lot of books out there on it, and they see roughly 7 to 10% of patients reporting very interesting facts that it would be hard to have just made up.
So what kind of facts are they reporting?
Things like being able to fully recount a conversation that had happened down the corridor in a different room in the hospital about the person that was on their deathbed, to the extent it was a little bit awkward because the content of the conversation wasn't good, but the patient upon resuscitation recounted it to their relatives. Other things like somebody observing a slightly random tennis shoe on a roof in another part of the hospital entirely that you could never have known about and the staff didn't know about because it's inaccessible, you can't climb up there. Another observation about a woman who was congenitally blind in her lifetime, who then, upon resuscitation, recounted the appearance of someone else who had also died moments earlier that she couldn't have known about. All sorts of extraordinary things that just give us pause for thought to say, human beings are really interesting. And even if some of these may have been fabricated, who knows? But even if one of these is a genuine instance...
But they couldn't have been fabricated because, like the tennis shoe,
right?
There's no way.
Right. But and even if all of them were except for one, for example, that still shows that you are way more than just your brain, because if your brain is clinically dead and you are still conscious, then you can't simply be your brain. There must be more to it.
Fascinating. Hugely. We're encouraged, Sharon, to love God with all of our mind, our heart. When we say heart, what does that mean?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think that the way that heart is used in the Bible is a little bit how soul is used, actually, and mind. And that quote from Deuteronomy in the words of Jesus, it's actually really talking about the sort of an inner reality. When I said there's something that it's like to be you, there's a you that can't be captured physically. There is more. When we talk about worshipping God with all of our heart, we're not referring to a particular bit of us that we can segment and put off to the side and say that's different from this. It's actually a measure of extent. When you worship God or follow him with all of your heart, that's a measure of degree, not anatomy or philosophy even. That's like, I'm giving it everything. I'm giving God all of me. And so I think that's what we mean by heart. And in a similar way, that's what we mean by mind and soul. Soul is a bit of a slippery term. Every time I think about it, I realize I still haven't got my head around the soul and exactly what it is. When we think about the soul, we often think of this immaterial part of us that maybe floats off to heaven one day to be with God. But actually that's a little bit more like how Plato would describe the soul than necessarily how the Bible describes the soul. In the Bible, the soul, as we've said, it's actually all of you. It's kind of the whole person, the physical and the non-physical, but it's sort of somehow breathed into with the life of God. It's a really complex topic to think about.
Your other book, Sharon, Why? Looking at God, evil, and personal suffering. And there are many, Sharon, many of us who are Christians, and there are some unanswered questions, aren't there? And we live in this world of miracle and mystery.
Yeah.
What do we do about those questions that haven't yet been answered?
Yes, and I think what is so important to say, and particularly as an apologist where we like to give answers, is that it's important to know where there are helpful things that we can say that help to frame things, and to realize where we are entering into the realm of mystery, and we need to kind of hold that before God. I think that, I'm encouraged that the very first book of the Bible chronologically is the book of Job, where he addresses this most universal problem and thing that everyone encounters one way or another. And we see this very interesting and at times very painful conversation between Job and his friends. But they are their most comforting right at the beginning when they don't say anything. There is something about the profundity of silence that captures the depth of a person's suffering, that words, as soon as you start to add words, you've lost something. I think apologists need to remember, particularly on this topic of suffering, and in the context that we find ourselves when all kinds of things are coming to light, that there is something very, very deep and profound and mysterious about suffering. We need to be prepared not just to give answers, but to sit with people in their pain and to feel it, but to gently offer the arms of Jesus as well, the God who knows what it is to suffer, who himself didn't shy away from suffering, and who entered into suffering like us and also for us, to somehow mean that when we suffer, we don't have to suffer alone. We can actually know the comfort and the arms of God in the things that life throws at us. And it throws many things, and sometimes it can feel unrelenting. And in the wake of a pandemic, we're all caught up in the same kind of suffering in some ways. But God knows, and he knows us and sees us. And if God doesn't exist, then this is just the way the world is. And we need to make the best of it. And this is the only life you get. But if God exists, we don't suffer alone. We don't suffer for nothing. And one day it will be ended. The Bible talks about not just heaven, but a new heaven and a new earth, which will be every bit as physical as this one and real, and in which God will wipe away every tear from our eyes, in which there'll be no more crying or mourning or suffering or pain. And it's extraordinary to me, as a mother, when I wipe away the tears from my children's eyes, it's the most delicate part of the eye. And we're told that God will spend time doing that. And that raises a question, how long is that going to take? This incredibly tender moment of comfort from God. Our suffering does not go unnoticed. We're not just a blip on the landscape or a statistic. We're seen and known by God. And that's what the Christian faith has to say to the question of suffering.
Beautiful, Sharon. I'm pleased that you're an apologist. You have the ability to articulate things simply and help us think things through. It's been a joy to talk to you. Thank you for joining us on Facing the Canon.
Thanks so much.
I hope that has inspired you. It really has inspired me. Do visit the website, find out more. Thank you so much for joining us on Facing the Canon. Please join us again.